Chapter 5 Part 2 Paul had seen people cry before, thousands of times, he would guess, but it had usually been within the sterile confines of a hospital waiting room, when he was fresh from an operation and still wearing scrubs. For him, the scrubs had served as a type of shield against the personal and emotional nature of his work. Never once had he cried with those he had spoken with, nor could he remember any of the faces of those who had once looked at him for answers. It wasn't something that he was proud to admit, but it was the person he had once been. But at this moment, as he looked into the red-rimmed eyes of the woman on the porch, he felt like an intruder on unfamiliar ground. His first instinct was to throw up the old defenses, yet there was something about the way she looked that made doing so impossible. It might have been the setting or the fact that she was alone. Either way, the surge of empathy was a foreign sensation, one that caught him completely off guard. Not having expected him to arrive until later, Adrian tried to overcome her embarrassment at being caught in such a state. Forcing a smile, she dabbed at her tears, trying to pretend the wind had caused them to moisten. As she turned to face him, however, she couldn't help but stare. It was his eyes, she thought, that did it. They were light blue, so light they seemed almost translucent, but there was an intensity in them that she had never seen before in anyone else. He knows me, she suddenly thought, or could know me if I gave him a chance. As quickly as those thoughts came, she dismissed them, thinking them ridiculous. No, she decided, there was nothing unusual about the man standing before her. He was simply the guest Jean had told her about, and since she hadn't been at the desk, he'd come looking for her. That was all. As a result, she found herself evaluating him in the way strangers often do. Though he wasn't as tall as Jack had been, maybe 5'10" or so, he was lean and fit, like someone who exercised daily. The sweater he was wearing was expensive and didn't match his faded jeans, but somehow he made it look as if it did. His face was angular, marked by lines in his forehead that spoke of years of forced concentration. His grey hair was trimmed short, and there were patches of white near his ears. She guessed he was in his 50s, but couldn't pin it down any more than that. Just then, Paul seemed to realize he was staring at her and dropped his gaze. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he mentioned over the shoulder. "I'll wait for you inside. Take your time." Adrian shook her head, trying to put him at ease. "It's okay. I was planning on coming in anyway." When she looked at him, she caught his eyes a second time. They were softer now, laced with a hint of memory, as though he were thinking of something sad but trying to hide it. She reached for her coffee cup, using it as an excuse to turn away. When Paul held open the door, she nodded for him to go ahead. As he walked ahead of her through the kitchen toward the reception area, Adrian caught herself eyeing his athletic physique, and she flushed slightly, wondering what on earth had gotten into her. Chiding herself, She moved behind the desk. She checked the name in the reservation book and glanced up. Paul Flanner, right? You're staying 5 nights and checking out Tuesday morning? Yes. He hesitated. Is it possible to get a room with a view of the ocean? Adrian pulled out the registration form. Sure, actually, you could have any of the rooms upstairs. You're the only guest scheduled this weekend. Which would you recommend? They're all nice, but if I were you, I'd take the blue room. The blue room? It's got the darkest curtains. If you sleep in the yellow or white rooms, you'll be up the crack of dawn. The shutters don't help all that much, and the sun comes up pretty early. The windows in those rooms face east. Adrian slid the form toward him and set the pen beside it. Could you sign here? Sure. Adrian watched as Paul scrawled his name, thinking as he signed that his hands matched his face. The bones of his knuckles were prominent, like those of an older man, but his movements were precise and measured. He wasn't wearing a wedding ring, she saw, not that it mattered. Paul set aside the pen and she reached for the form, making sure he had filled it out correctly. His address was listed in care of an attorney in Raleigh. From the backboard off the side, she retrieved a room key, hesitated, then selected 2 more. Okay, we're all set here, she said. You ready to see a room? Please. Paul stepped back as she made her way around the desk towards the stairs. He grabbed his duffel bag, then started after her. When she reached the steps, she paused, letting him catch up. She motioned toward the sitting room. I have coffee and some cookies right over there. I made the pot an hour ago, so it should still be fresh for a while. I saw it when I came in. Thank you. At the top of the steps, Adrian turned, her hand still resting on the balustrade. There were 4 rooms upstairs, 1 near the front of the house and 3 that faced the ocean. On the doors, Paul saw nameplates, not numbers. Bodie, Hatteras, and Cape Lookout, and he recognized them as the names of the lighthouses along the outer banks. You can take your pick, Adrian said. I brought all the 3 keys in case you like another one better. Paul looked from one room to the next. Which one is the blue room? Oh, that's just what I call it. Jean calls it the body suite. Jean? Oh, she's the owner. I'm just watching the place while she's gone. The straps of the duffel bag were pinching his neck, and Paul shifted them as Adrian unlocked the door. She held the door open for him, feeling the duffel bag bump against her as he wedged by. Paul glanced around. The room was just about what he had imagined it would be, simple and clean, but with more character than a typical beachfront motel room. There was a 4-poster bed centered beneath the window with an end table beside it. On the ceiling, a fan was whirring slowly, just enough to move the air. In the far corner, near a large painting of Bodie Lighthouse, there was a doorway that Paul assumed led to the bathroom. Along the near wall stood a worn-looking chest of the drawers that looked as if it had been in the room since the inn had been built. With the exception of the furniture, pretty much everything was tinted various shades of blue. The throw rug on the floor was a color of robin's eggs, the comforter and curtains were navy, the lamp on the end table was somewhere in between and shiny, like the paint on a new car, though the chest of drawers and the end table were eggshell. They'd been decorated with scenes of the ocean beneath summer skies. Even the phone was blue, which gave it the appearance of a toy. "What do you think?" "It's definitely blue," he said. "Do you want to see other rooms?" Paul set the duffel bag on the floor as he looked out the window. "No, this will be fine. Is it okay if I open the window, though? It's kind of stuffy in here." "Go ahead." Paul crossed the room, flipped the latch, and lifted the pane. Because the home had been painted so many times over the years, the window caught after about an inch. As Paul struggled to raise it further, Adrian could see the wiry muscles of his forearm knot and flex. She cleared her throat. "I guess you should know it's my first time watching the inn," she said. "I've been here lots of times, but always when Jean was here, so if something's not right, don't think twice about telling me." Paul turned around. With his back to the glass, his features were lost in shadows. "I'm not worried," he said. "I'm not too picky these days." Adrian smiled as she pulled the key from the door. "Okay, things you should know. Jean told me to go over these. There is a wall heater beneath the window, and all you have to do is turn it on. There is only 2 settings, and in the beginning it'll make a clicking noise, but it'll stop after a few minutes. There are fresh towels in the bathroom. If you need more, just let me know. And even though it seems to take forever, the hot water does eventually come out of the nozzle, I promise." Adrian caught a glimpse of Paul's smile as she went on. "And unless we get someone else this weekend, and I'm not expecting anyone else with the storm, unless they get stranded," she said. "We can eat whenever you'd like. Normally Jean serves breakfast at 8 and dinner is at 7, but if you're busy then just let me know and we can eat whenever. Or I can make you something that you could take with you." "Thanks." She paused, her mind searching for anything else to say. "Oh, one more thing. Before you use the phone, you should know it's only set up to make local calls. If you want to dial long distance, you'll have to use a calling card or call collect, and you'll have to go through the operator." "Okay." She hesitated in the doorway. "Anything else you need to know?" "I think that just about covers it. Except, of course, for the obvious." "What's that?" "You haven't told me your name yet." She set the key on the chest of drawers beside the door and smiled. "I'm Adrian Willis." Paul crossed the room, and surprising her, he offered his hand. "Nice to meet you, Adrian." Chapter 6. Paul had come to Rodanthe at the request of Robert Torrelson, and as he unpacked a few items from the duffel bag and placed them in the drawers, he wondered again what Robert wanted to say to him, or if he expected Paul to do most of the talking. Jill Torrelson had come to him because she had a meningioma, a benign cyst. It wasn't life-threatening ailment, but it was unsightly to say the least. The meningioma was on the right side of her face, extending from the bridge of her nose and over the cheek, forming a bulbous purple mass, punctuated by scars where it had ulcerated over the years. Paul had operated on dozens of patients with meningioma, and he had received many letters from those who had undergone the operation, expressing how thankful they were for what he had done. He'd gone over it 1,000 times, and he still didn't know why she had died, nor it seemed could science provide the answer. The autopsy on Jill was inconclusive, and the cause of death had not been determined. At first, they assumed she had had an embolism of some sort, but they could find no evidence of it. After that, they focused on the idea that she had had an allergic reaction to the anesthesia or post-surgical medication, but those were eventually ruled out as well. So was negligence on Paul's part. The surgery had gone off without a hitch, and a close examination by the coroner had found nothing out of the ordinary with the procedure or anything that might have been even tangentially responsible for her death. The videotape had confirmed it. Because the meningioma was considered typical, the procedure had been videotaped by the hospital for potential use in instruction by the faculty. Afterward, it had been reviewed by the surgical board of the hospital and 3 additional surgeons from out of the state. Again, nothing was found to be amiss. There were some medical conditions mentioned in the report. Jill Torrelson was overweight and her arteries had thickened. In time, she may have needed a coronary bypass. She had diabetes and, as a lifelong smoker, the beginning of emphysema, though again, neither of these conditions seemed life-threatening at present, and neither adequately explained what had happened. Jill Torrelson, it seemed, had died for no reason at all, as if God had simply called her home. Like so many others in the situation, Robert Torrelson had filed a wrongful death suit. The lawsuit named Paul, the hospital, and the anesthesiologist as defendants. Paul, like most surgeons, was covered by malpractice insurance. As was customary, he was instructed not to speak to Robert Torrelson without an attorney present, and even then only if he was being deposed, and Robert Torrelson happened to be in the room. The case had gone nowhere for a year. Once Robert Torrelson's attorney received the autopsy report, had another surgeon review the videotape, and the attorneys from the insurance company and hospital started the process of filing motions to drag out the process and run up the costs. He had painted a bleak picture of what his client was up against. Though they didn't say so directly, the attorneys for the insurance company expected Robert Torrelson to eventually drop the suit. It was like the few other cases that had been filed against Paul Flanner over the years, except for the fact that Paul had received a personal note from Robert Torrelson 2 months ago. He didn't need to bring it with him to recall what had been written. Dear Dr. Flanner, I'd like to talk to you in person. This is very important to me. please, Robert Torrelson. At the bottom of the letter, he had left his address. After reading it, Paul had showed it to the attorneys, and they had urged him to ignore it. So had his former colleagues at the hospital. Just let it go, they said. Once this over, we can set up a meeting with him if he still wants to talk. But there was something in the simple plea above the Robert Torrelson's neatly scrawled signature that had gotten to Paul, and he had decided not to listen to them. To his mind, he'd ignored too many things already. Paul put on his jacket, walked down the steps and went out the front door, heading towards the car. From the front seat, he grabbed the leather pouch containing his passport and tickets. But instead of going back inside, he made his way around the side of the house. On the beach side, the wind grew cold, and Paul paused for a moment to zip his jacket. Pinching the leather pouch beneath his arm, he tucked his hands into his jacket and bowed his head, feeling the breeze nip at his cheeks. The sky reminded him of those he had seen in Baltimore before the snowstorms that tinted the world onto shades of washed-out gray. In the distance, he could see a pelican gliding low over the water, its wings unmoving, floating with the wind. He wondered where it would go when the storm hit full force. Near the water, Paul stopped. The waves were rolling in from two different directions, sending up plumes as they collided. The air was moist and chilly. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw the light in the kitchen of the inn glowing yellow. Adrian's figure passed shadow-like by the window, then vanishing from sight. He would try to talk to Robert Torrelson tomorrow morning, he thought. The storm was expected to arrive in the afternoon and would probably last through most of the weekend, so he couldn't do it then. Nor did he want to wait until Monday. His flight left on Tuesday afternoon out of Dulles, and he had to leave Rodanthe no later than 9. He didn't want to run the risk of not speaking with him, and in light of the storm, one day was cutting it close. By Monday, power lines might be down, there might be flooding, or Robert Torrelson might be taken care of, who knew what in the aftermath. Paul had never been in Rodanthe before, but he didn't think it would take more than a few minutes to find the house. The town, he figured, had no more than a few dozen streets, and he could walk the length of the town in less than half an hour. After a few minutes on the sand, Paul turned and started making his way back towards the inn. As he did, he caught a glimpse of Adrian Willis in the window again. Her smile, he thought. He liked her smile. From the window, Adrian found herself glancing at Paul Flanner as he made his way back from the beach. She was unpacking the groceries, doing her best to put them in the right cupboards. Earlier in the afternoon, she bought the items that Jean had recommended, but now she wondered if she should have waited until Paul arrived to ask him if there was anything in particular that he wanted to eat. His visit intrigued her. She knew from Jean that when he had called 6 weeks ago, she had said that she closed up after the New Year and wouldn't open again until April. But he had offered to pay double the room rate if she could stay open an extra week. He wasn't on vacation. She was sure of that. Not only because Rodanthe was a popular destination in winter, but because he didn't strike her as the vacationing type. nor was his demeanor when he had checked in that of someone who would come here to relax. He hadn't mentioned that he was visiting family either, so that meant he was probably here for business. But that too didn't make much sense. Other than fishing and tourism, there wasn't much business in Rodanthe, and with the exception of those businesses that provided the necessities for those who had lived here, most of them closed down for the winter anyway. She was still trying to figure it out when she heard him coming up the back steps. She listened as he stomped the sand from his feet outside the door. A moment later, the back door opened with a squeak, and Paul walked into the kitchen. As he shrugged off his jacket, she noticed that the tip of his nose had turned red. "I think the storm's getting close," he said. "The temperature's dropped at least 10 degrees since this morning." Adrian put a box of crotons into the cupboard and looked over her shoulder as she answered. "I know, I had to turn the heater up. This isn't the most energy efficient of homes. I could actually feel the wind coming in through the windows. Sorry you don't have better weather?" Paul rubbed his arms. "That's the way it goes. Is the coffee still out? I think I could use a cup to warm up." "Oh, it might be a little stale by now. I'll make a fresh pot. It'll only take a few minutes." "You wouldn't mind?" "Not at all. I think I could use one too." "Thank you. Just let me put my jacket in my room and clean up, and I'll be right back down." He smiled at her before he left the kitchen, and Adrian felt herself exhale, unaware she had been holding her breath in his absence. She ground a handful of fresh beans, changed the filter, and started the coffee. She retrieved the silver pot, poured the contents down the sink, and rinsed it out. As she worked, she could hear him moving in the room above her. Though she had known in advance that he would be the only guest this weekend, she hadn't realized how strange it would seem to be alone in the house with him. Or alone, period. Sure, the kids had their own activities and she had a little time to herself now and then, but it wasn't never for long. They could pop back in at any moment. Besides, they were family. It wasn't quite the same as the situation she was in now, and she couldn't escape the feeling that she was living someone else's life, one in which she wasn't exactly sure of the rules. She made a cup of coffee for herself and poured the rest into the silver pot. She was putting the pot back on the tray in the sitting room when she heard him coming down the stairs. "Just in time," she said. "Coffee's ready. Would you like me to get the fire going?" As Paul entered the sitting room, she caught a trace of cologne. He reached around her for a cup. "No, that's okay. I'm comfortable. Maybe later." She nodded and took a small step backward. "Well, if you need anything, I'll be in the kitchen." "I thought you said you wanted a cup." "I already poured one. I left it on the counter." He looked up. "You're not going to join me?" There was something expectant in the way he asked, as if he really wanted her to stay. She hesitated. Jean was good at making small talk with strangers, but she never had been. At the same time, she was flattered by his offer, though she wasn't sure why. "I suppose I could," she finally said. "Just let me get my cup." By the time she'd returned, Paul was sitting in one of the two glider rockers near the fireplace, with the black and white photographs along the wall that depicted life in the Outer Banks during the 1920s, and a long shelf of thumbed-through books. This had always been her favorite room in the inn. There were two windows along the far wall that looked to the ocean. A small stack of cordwood was piled near the fireplace, along with a container of kindling, as if promising a cozy evening with family. Paul was holding his cup of coffee in his lap, rocking back and forth, taking in a few. The wind was making the sand blow, and the fog was rolling in, giving the world outside an illusion of dusk. Adrian sat in the chair next to his and for a moment watched the scene in silence, trying not to feel nervous. Paul turned toward her. "Do you think the storm's going to blow us away tomorrow?" he asked. Adrian ran her hand through her hair. "I doubt it. This place has been here for 60 years, and it hasn't blown away yet." "Have you ever been here during a nor'easter? A big one, I mean, like the one they're expecting." "No, but Jean has, so it can't be too bad. But then again, she's from here, so maybe she's used to it." As she answered Paul found himself evaluating her, younger by a few years than he was, with light brown hair cut just above the shoulder blades and curled slightly. She wasn't thin, but she wasn't heavy either. To him, her figure was inviting in a way that defied the unrealistic standards of television or magazines. She had a slight bump on her nose, crow's feet around her eyes, and her skin had reached that soft point in between youth and age before gravity began to take its toll. "And you said she's a friend?" "Oh, we met in college years ago. Jean was one of my roommates, and we've kept in touch ever since. This used to be her grandparents' house, but her parents converted it into an inn. After you made arrangements with her to stay, she called me, since she had an out-of-town wedding to attend." "But you don't live here?" "Oh no, I live in Rocky Mount. Have you ever been there?" "Oh, many times. I used to pass through on trips to Greenville." At his answer, Adrian wondered again about the address she had listed on the registration form. She took a sip of coffee and lowered the cup to her lap. "I know it's none of my business," she said, "but can I ask what you're doing here? You don't have to answer if you don't want. I'm just curious." Paul shifted in his chair. "I am here to talk to someone." "That's a long way to drive to have a conversation." "I didn't have much of a choice. He wanted to meet in person." His voice sounded tight and remote, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. In the silence, Adrian could hear the whipping of the flag out front. Paul set his coffee on the table between them. "What do you do?" he finally asked, his voice warming again. "Beside watching Bed and Breakfast for Friends, I work in the public library. You do? You sound surprised. I guess I am. I expected you to say something different. Like what? To be honest, I'm not sure. Just not that. You don't look old enough to be a librarian. Where I live, they're all in their 60s. She smiled. It's only part-time. I have 3 kids, so I do the mum thing too. How old are they? 18, 17, and 15. Do they keep you busy? Not at all, really. As long as I'm up by 5 and don't go to bed until midnight, it's not too bad. He chuckled under his breath, and Adrian felt herself beginning to relax. How about you? Do you have children? Just one, a son. For a moment, his eyes dropped, but he came back to her again. He's a doctor in Ecuador. He lives there? For the time being, he's volunteering his services for a couple of years at a clinic near Esmeraldas. You must be proud of him. I am. He paused. But to be honest, he must have gotten that from my wife, or rather, my ex-wife. It was more her doing than mine. Adrian smiled. That's nice to hear. What? That you still appreciate her good qualities, even though you've divorced. I mean, I don't hear a lot of people saying those things after they split up. Usually when people talk about their exes, all they bring up are the things that they went wrong on or bad things that other person said or did. Paul wondered if she was speaking from personal experience, guessing that she was. Tell me more about your kids, Adrian. What do they like to do? Adrian took another sip of her coffee, thinking how odd it was to hear him saying her name. My kids? Oh well, let's see. Matt was the starting quarterback on the football team, and now he's playing guard on the basketball team. Amanda loves drama, and she just won the lead to play Maria in West Side Story. And Dan, well, right now Dan is playing basketball too, but next year. He thinks he might go out for wrestling instead. The coach has been begging him to try out since he saw him at sports camp last summer. Paul raised his eyebrows. Impressive. What can I say? It was all their mother's doing. She quipped. Why does not that surprise me? She smiled. Of course, those are just their good parts. Had I told you about their mood swings or their attitudes or let you see their messy rooms, you'd probably think I was doing a terrible job raising them. Paul smiled. I doubt it. What I think is that you were raising teenagers. In other words, you're telling me that your son, the conscientious doctor, went through all this too, so I shouldn't lose hope? I'm sure he did. You don't know for sure, though? Not really. He paused. I wasn't around as much as I should have been. There was a time in my life when I used to work too much. She could tell it was a difficult admission for him, and she wondered why he had said it. Before she could dwell on it, the phone rang and they both turned at the sound. Excuse me, she said. rising from his seat. "I have to get that." Paul watched her walk away, noticing again how attractive she was. In spite of the direction of his medical practice had been taking in later years, he had always remained less interested in appearance than those things a person couldn't see: kindness and integrity, humor and sensibility. Adrian, he was sure, had all those traits, but he got the feeling that they'd been unappreciated for a long time, maybe even by her. He could tell that she had been nervous when she first sat down, and he found that oddly endearing. Too often, especially in his line of work, people seemed intent on trying to impress, making sure they said the right things, showcasing those things they did well. Others rambled on as if they viewed conversation as one-way street, and nothing was more boring than a blowhard. None of those traits seemed to apply to Adrian, and he had to admit it. It was nice to talk to someone who didn't know him. During the past few months, he had alternated between spending time alone or fending off questions as to whether or not he was feeling okay. More than once, colleagues had recommended the name of good therapist and confided that the person had helped him. Paul had grown tired of explaining that he knew what he was doing and that he was sure of his decision. And he was even more tired of the looks of concern they offered in response. But there was something about Adrian that made him feel she would understand what he was going through. He couldn't explain why he felt that way or why it mattered, but either way, he was sure of it.